The Schlisselburg Fortress, an inhospitable and frozen prison island on Lake Ladoga near St. Petersburg on the night of July 4th, 1764. In the darkness of a miserable cell, barely lit by the dying light of a candle, a pale and sickly-looking young man of 23 lies murdered on his cot, his still warm body pierced by multiple bayonet thrusts. He is Ivan Antonovich, known to history as Ivan VI of Russia, the boy emperor, the monarch who reigned for barely a year, 1740 to 1741, as a baby of only a few months old, and who spent the rest of his short and tragic life as a prisoner of the state, isolated from the world, forgotten by many and feared by a few. His violent and premature death, ordered in secret by Empress Catherine the Great, put an end to one of the most unhappy and anonymous existences in European royalty, that of a Russian man in the Iron Mask, a phantom prince whose mere existence represented a constant threat to the stability of the Romanov throne. Who was Ivan VI really? The ephemeral emperor whose name was erased from the records and whose image was destroyed so that no one would remember his face? Was he the victim of excessive dynastic ambition, a cruel and relentless power game, or simply an adverse fate that condemned him from the cradle to a life of confinement and a violent death? And was his murder a necessary act of state to prevent a possible restoration or civil war, or an abominable crime that forever tarnished the reign of the enlightened Catherine the Great? This is the chronicle of a life stolen, the story of a child emperor imprisoned for life and ultimately murdered, a specter that haunted Russia's conscience for decades. Join me as I unravel the secrets of Schlisselburg, explore the tragedy of Ivan VI, and reflect on the cruelty of power and the fragility of innocence in a world dominated by ambition and intrigue. Was Ivan VI a mere pawn on the chessboard of history, or does his tragic fate hold a deeper lesson about the nature of power and justice? The mystery of the boy emperor lurks in the shadows of Russian history, and his blood cries out even today for an explanation. To understand the full tragic dimension of the ill-fated and almost forgotten figure of Ivan VI of Russia, and to comprehend the complex and often ruthless political and dynastic circumstances that led him from the imperial cradle to an anonymous grave in a remote prison, it is absolutely essential that we first immerse ourselves with due attention to historical detail in mid-18th century Russia, a vast and complex empire which, following the modernizing and westernizing reforms of Peter the Great, was undergoing a period of profound transformation, territorial expansion, and growing influence in the concert of European powers, but also an empire marked by unlimited autocracy, frequent palace coups, violent power struggles between rival noble factions, and alarming instability in the line of succession of the Romanov dynasty. Ivan Antonovich, who would go down in history as Ivan VI, was born in St. Petersburg on August 23, 1740, according to the Gregorian calendar. He belonged on his mother's side to the Romanov imperial family, although to a secondary branch somewhat removed from the main line. His mother was Princess Anna Leopoldovna of Mecklenburg-Schwerin, a woman of German origin, indolent in character and ill-suited to politics, who was the niece of the then reigning Empress of Russia, Anna Ioannovna, herself the niece of Peter the Great. His father was Prince Anthony Ulrich of Brunswick-Lüneburg, a German military man of little brilliance and even less political influence. The birth of little Ivan came at a time of great uncertainty regarding the succession. Empress Anna Ioannovna, who had no children of her own, was seriously ill and concerned about securing the continuity of her family line on the throne, excluding the branch of her cousin Peter the Great, represented by his daughter Elizabeth Petrovna, the future Empress Elizabeth Worse, whom Anna detested and feared. Therefore, shortly before her death in October 1740, Empress Anna designated her newborn grandnephew, the infant Ivan Antonovich, who was then only 2 months old, as her successor to the imperial throne in her will. To ensure governability during the child emperor's minority, Anna appointed her favorite and lover, the powerful and unpopular Curonian nobleman Ernst Johann von Bieren, Duke of Courland, as regent. Thus, in the most unexpected and almost accidental manner, a baby barely a few weeks old, who could barely hold his head up, became Ivan VI, emperor and autocrat of all Russia. His accession to the throne, or rather his placement on it, was met with a mixture of astonishment, skepticism, and deep discontent on the part of large sections of the Russian nobility and the imperial guard, who viewed Byron's omnipotent power and the prospect of a long period of regency dominated by foreigners of German origin with disfavor. Byron's regency, characterized by arrogance, cruelty, and contempt for Russian traditions, lasted only a few weeks. In November 1740, a palace coup, plotted by Field Marshal Burkhard Christoph von Munich, another German in Russian service, but a rival of Byron, and supported by the Guard, deposed Byron and sent him into exile. The regency then passed to the child emperor's mother, Anna Leopoldovna, a well-meaning but politically inept woman, lazy and completely dominated by her favorites and the intrigues of her small German court. Her brief period of rule, 1740 to 1741, was marked by incompetence, corruption, internal struggles between rival factions, and growing popular and military discontent. The uncertain crown of little Ivan VI, who never became aware of his own royalty, hung by an increasingly thin thread. Meanwhile, in the shadows, Elizabeth Petrovna, the daughter of Peter the Great, a woman of great beauty, charisma, and ambition, who had been unjustly removed from the line of succession by Anna Ioannovna, waited patiently for her opportunity. Supported by the national faction of the Russian nobility, which longed to free itself from the domination of German foreigners, and counting on the sympathy of a significant part of the Imperial Guard, especially the Preobrazhensky Regiment, Elizabeth began to weave the threads of a new conspiracy. The omens of a new coup d'etat, which this time would have as its victims the innocent child emperor and his inept regent mother, were gathering in the tense atmosphere of St. Petersburg. A new enigma was beginning to take shape. What would be the fate of that child crowned in his cradle, whose only crime was to have been born in the wrong place at the wrong time? And a symbolic object, the fortress of Schlisselburg, that inhospitable and isolated prison on an island in Lake Ladoga, which had already housed illustrious prisoners and would become the living tomb of Ivan VI, began to cast its sinister shadow over the future of the boy emperor. His brief and unconscious reign on the Russian throne was about to end in the most tragic and brutal way. The downward spiral that, in just 1 year, would take the small and innocent Ivan VI from the imperial cradle, where he had been proclaimed emperor and autocrat of all Russia, to the darkest and most anonymous of prisons, was a dizzying, relentless process completely beyond his own will or consciousness. His short-lived reign, which was in reality a succession of unstable and corrupt regencies, was marked from the outset by the perceived illegitimacy of his accession to the throne, by the Russian nobility's visceral hatred of the rule of foreign favorites of German origin, and by the dynastic ambitions of other members of the Romanov family, especially those of Elizabeth Petrovna, the charismatic and popular daughter of Peter the Great. After the fall of the hated regent Ernest John von Biron in November 1740, just a few weeks after the death of Empress Anna Ioannovna, the regency of the child emperor Ivan VI passed to his mother, Princess Anna Leopoldovna of Mecklenburg-Schwerin. Anna Leopoldovna, a woman of about 22, indolent, apathetic, and ill-equipped for affairs of state, proved from the outset completely overwhelmed by the responsibilities of government and the complex intrigues of the Russian court. She spent most of her time devoted to pleasures, trivial amusements, and disputes with her insignificant husband, Prince Anthony Ulrich of Brunswick, completely neglecting the administration of the vast empire and leaving important decisions in the hands of a clique of advisors and favorites, mostly Germans, such as Field Marshal Burkhard Christoph von Munich, who had led the coup against Byron but soon fell into disgrace, and later Count Andrei Osterman. Anna Leopoldovna's rule was characterized by incompetence, widespread corruption, infighting between different factions of the court, and growing discontent among both the Russian nobility, who felt marginalized and humiliated by the dominance of foreigners, and the Imperial Guard, who were the real arbiters of power in Russia at the time. The popularity of the regent and her young son, Emperor Ivan VI, who was rarely shown in public and whose existence was almost unknown to most of the population, plummeted rapidly. Meanwhile, in the shadows, the figure of Grand Duchess Elizabeth Petrovna, the daughter of Peter the Great, was gaining more and more support and sympathy. Elizabeth, then around 32 years old, was a woman of dazzling beauty, overwhelming charisma, and considerable political astuteness, although this was often concealed beneath an appearance of frivolity and a love of pleasure. As the direct daughter of Russia's great transformer, many saw her as the legitimate heir to the throne and the only one capable of restoring the prestige of the Romanov dynasty and freeing the country from the hated yoke of German favorites. Supported by an important faction of the Russian national nobility, by foreign diplomats such as the French ambassador, the Marquis de la Chetardie, who saw her as a potential ally against Austria, then an ally of Russia, and above all, by a group of officers and soldiers from the Guard regiments, especially the Preobrazhensky regiment, who professed almost fanatical loyalty to her, Elizabeth began to patiently and skillfully weave the threads of a new palace conspiracy aimed at overthrowing Anna Leopoldovna and her son Ivan VI, and seizing the imperial crown for herself. The worsening internal conflict at court, the blunders and mistakes of Anna Leopoldovna's government, and the growing unpopularity of the Germans created the perfect breeding ground for the coup. Rumors spread, perhaps false or exaggerated but effective, about Anna Leopoldovna's alleged plans to marry a foreign prince and thus consolidate German rule over Russia, or about her intention to send Elizabeth into exile or to a convent to eliminate her as a dynastic rival. Tension in St. Petersburg was at its height in the autumn of 1741. Elizabeth, aware that the moment was ripe and that any delay could be fatal to her aspirations, decided to act. On the night of November 24th, 1741, according to the Julian calendar then in use in Russia, corresponding to December 5th, 6 in the Gregorian calendar, Elizabeth Petrovna, wearing armor and accompanied by a small group of her most loyal supporters and a detachment of grenadiers from the Preobrazhensky regiment, made her way to the Winter Palace, the residence of the imperial family. The coup was surprisingly quick, bloodless, and effective. The guards guarding the palace, mostly sympathizers of Elizabeth or simply dissatisfied with Anna Leopoldovna's regime, offered little resistance. The regent, her husband Anthony Ulrich, and the young emperor Ivan VI, who was sleeping peacefully in his cradle, completely unaware of the events that would seal his tragic fate, were arrested in their quarters without a single shot being fired. The next morning, Elizabeth Petrovna was proclaimed Empress and Autocrat of all Russia, under the name Elizabeth Return, to the jubilation of her supporters and the relief of much of the population of St. Petersburg, who saw in her the restoration of the direct line of Peter the Great and the end of the hated German rule. The reign of the child emperor Ivan VI, which had lasted barely 13 months, thus came to an abrupt and pathetic end. The downward spiral had been completed in the most rapid and relentless manner. The internal hook of this coup d'etat, the ease with which it took place, and the apparent passivity of the defenders of Ivan VI's regime reveal the fragility of his power and the unpopularity of his government. The partial revelation of Elizabeth's ambition and determination, although understandable from a dynastic perspective, nevertheless raises questions about the justice and morality of her actions, especially with regard to the fate she would reserve for the innocent deposed child. Anna Leopoldovna's desperation, paranoia, or denial in the face of the conspiracy brewing around her are evident in her inability to react in time and her complete lack of foresight. As for little Ivan, his only crime had been to be born into an imperial family and to be used as a pawn in the ruthless power game of adults. From that moment on, his fate was sealed by the constant fear of his successors that his mere existence could be used by discontented factions to question the legitimacy of the new regime and promote a restoration. The Russian Iron Mask was about to be forged. In the case of the unfortunate Ivan VI, the shadow of the executioner did not take the form of a public trial or immediate execution, but rather that of perpetual, cruel, and progressively isolating confinement, a psychological and physical torment that would last for more than 2 decades and slowly consume him in darkness, loneliness, and oblivion, until his tragic and violent end. After the successful coup d'etat in November 1741 that brought her to the throne, the new Empress Elizabeth I faced the delicate and dangerous problem of what to do with the deposed child emperor Ivan VI and his family. His parents, Anna Leopoldovna and Anthony Ulrich, and his younger siblings, who would be born during his captivity. Although Ivan was just a baby of little more than a year old, and therefore completely innocent of any crime or conspiracy, his mere existence, his Romanov blood, and the fact that he had been legally proclaimed emperor made him a constant potential threat to the legitimacy and stability of Elizabeth's reign. Despite being the daughter of Peter the Great, Elizabeth had acceded to the throne through a coup d'état and not through direct and uncontested dynastic succession. Elizabeth, although generally benevolent and reluctant to shed unnecessary blood, her reign was characterized by the abolition of the death penalty, although not of torture or cruel corporal punishment, was also a pragmatic politician, aware of the fragility of her own power in a country accustomed to palace conspiracies. She therefore decided to keep Ivan and his family in the strictest secrecy and under rigorous surveillance, with the aim of erasing their memory from the collective consciousness and preventing them from being used as a banner by any opposition faction. The deterioration of Ivan VI's situation, and that of his family, was a gradual but inexorable process, marked by successive transfers to increasingly remote and isolated prisons and a progressive hardening of the conditions of their captivity. Initially, they were confined to the fortress of Riga in present-day Latvia. Then, fearing possible rescue attempts or conspiracies, they were transferred to Dunemunde and later to Ravensburg. Finally, in 1744, the family was separated and imprisoned in Kolmogorye, a remote and frozen town in northern Russia, near Arkhangelsk, on the banks of the northern Dvina River. There, in Kolmogorye, Ivan VI spent most of his childhood and adolescence in almost total isolation from the outside world. He lived with his parents and siblings. 4 more were born during their captivity: Catherine, Elizabeth, Peter, and Alexei, but in extremely precarious conditions and under constant surveillance. They were forbidden any contact with the outside world. Their correspondence was censored, and every effort was made to ensure that their existence remained unknown to the rest of the world. It was even decreed that all coins, documents, and portraits bearing the name or image of Ivan VI should be destroyed in a desperate attempt to erase any trace of his short-lived reign. Anna Leopoldovna, Ivan's mother, died in Kolmogorye in 1746, at the age of 27, probably as a result of complications during the birth of her last child or the harsh conditions of captivity. Her death plunged the young Ivan, then only 6 years old, into even greater loneliness. His father, Anthony Ulrich, a mediocre and resigned man, would survive his wife by many years, but he would never regain his freedom or see his eldest son again once he was separated from the family. Descriptions of Ivan VI's physical and mental state during his long imprisonment in Kolmogorye are scarce and often contradictory, as they are based on reports by his jailers, who had an interest in portraying him as brutalized or deficient in order to justify his confinement. However, it seems that, despite his isolation and lack of proper formal education, Ivan retained a certain lucidity and a vague and confused awareness of his royal origins. It is said that he taught himself to read and write using a Bible that was given to him, and that he sometimes showed flashes of natural intelligence and deep melancholy. His isolation from the outside world was almost complete. He was not allowed to see anyone other than his jailers and a priest who visited him occasionally. He knew nothing of children's games, the amusements of youth, or the affection of a normal family. His only companions were the walls of his prison, the vague memory of his parents, and the constant presence of his guards, who had strict orders not to reveal his true identity, or to speak to him of his past as emperor. The reactions of the court, the imperial family, what remained of it that was not directly involved in his custody, and the Russian people to the secret existence and cruel fate of the nameless prisoner were a mixture of fear, morbid curiosity, and, in many cases, calculated indifference. For Empress Elizabeth, Ivan VI remained a latent threat, a ghost that could reappear at any moment to destabilize her throne. She therefore became obsessed with his safety and with keeping him in the utmost secrecy. It is said that she even visited Kolmogorye incognito to see him through a peephole, and that she was struck by his resemblance to her own father, Peter the Great. Ivan was the great-grandson of Peter V, Peter the Great's older brother, which may have heightened her fears. In 1756, when Ivan VI was 16 years old, and his existence was becoming an open secret in some circles of the court and abroad, Empress Elizabeth, perhaps fearing a rescue attempt or simply wanting greater control over her prisoner, ordered his transfer to the fortress of Schlüsselburg, an inhospitable island prison with a sinister reputation located on Lake Ladoga, near St. Petersburg. Schlüsselburg, known as the Russian Bastille, was a maximum security prison reserved for the most dangerous state criminals and personal enemies of the Tsars. There, Ivan VI was locked in a solitary cell, even more isolated and lonely than the one in Kolmogorye. He was given the code name Prisoner Number 1, or the Unknown, and his guards were given strict orders that, in the event of any attempt to escape or rescue him, they were to kill him immediately, without hesitation, and without waiting for further instructions. The clock ticking for his death, although it would still be some years before it struck, had already been set in motion by the Empress herself. The last desperate attempts to save himself, to redeem himself, or to find a way out of his terrible situation, if Ivan VI ever had the opportunity or the ability to conceive of them, were doomed to failure from the outset. His life was a tragedy waiting to happen, a human sacrifice on the altar of reason of state and dynastic security. Hope, if he ever had any, had long since vanished in the darkness of his successive prisons. The shadow of the executioner, in his case, was not that of a trial or a sentence, but that of a secret, cold, and calculated order that hung constantly over his head. The last night, or rather the last years, of the tragic and almost forgotten existence of Ivan VI of Russia were spent in utter darkness, in the cruelest isolation and deepest despair of his cell in the Schlüsselburg fortress. There, on that inhospitable and frozen prison island, surrounded by the cold waters of Lake Ladoga and the impenetrable walls of the fortress, the young man who had been emperor of all Russia in the cradle and who had spent his entire conscious life as a prisoner of the state, faced a fate that seemed sealed from birth, oblivion or violent death. After the death of Empress Elizabeth Weimar in 1762 and the brief and chaotic reign of her nephew Peter III, who curiously showed a certain sympathy for the prisoner of Schlüsselburg and even visited him, which may have increased the court's fears about his possible release. The Russian throne was usurped by Peter's wife, the ambitious and cunning German princess who would go down in history as Catherine II the Great. Catherine, although she presented herself to Europe as an enlightened and reformist monarch, was also a pragmatic and ruthless politician when it came to securing her own power, which she had gained through a coup d'etat and the subsequent assassination of her husband. For Catherine, the existence of Ivan VI, even though he had been imprisoned for more than 20 years and was virtually unknown to the world, still represented a potential threat, a possible pretender to the throne who could be used by discontented factions or foreign powers to destabilize her regime. Therefore, she not only kept Ivan in strict isolation in Schlüsselburg, but also reinforced the secret orders already given by Empress Elizabeth. In the event of any attempt to free the prisoner, he was to be executed immediately by his guards. Ivan VI's life in Schlüsselburg was one of indescribable monotony and cruelty. Locked in a damp, dark, and poorly ventilated cell, with little human contact beyond his rough jailers, who were forbidden to speak to him or reveal their true identities, without books, except perhaps a Bible, without news of the outside world, and under constant surveillance, his mind, which according to some accounts had shown flashes of intelligence in his youth, began to deteriorate progressively. It is said that he spent long hours in silence, plunged into a deep apathy, or that he sometimes suffered fits of rage or despair. His physical health also suffered, and his appearance became pale, sickly, and prematurely aged. However, despite all efforts to erase his memory and nullify his personality, Ivan VI, or at least the legend surrounding him, remained an uncomfortable ghost for Catherine's throne. And it was precisely this legend, this persistent memory of a deposed and unjustly imprisoned emperor, that would trigger the final tragedy. In the summer of 1764, a young and ambitious Russian army officer, Lieutenant Vasily Mirovich, who was serving in the Schlüsselburg garrison and knew of the existence of the mysterious prisoner number 1, conceived a bold and reckless plan to free him and proclaim him emperor once again, hoping thereby to gain the favor of the supposed restored monarch and perhaps a prominent place in a new regime. Mirovich, who apparently acted on his own initiative and without the support of any major political faction, managed to convince some of his soldiers to join his conspiracy. On the night of July 4th, 1764, Mirovich and his men attempted to storm the section of the fortress where Ivan VI was being held. A brief but intense firefight ensued with the prisoners' guards. The latter, following strict orders and seeing that they could not resist the attack and that Ivan's liberation was imminent, took the drastic decision to execute their prisoner. Two of the officers in charge of his custody, Captain Vlasiev and Lieutenant Chekin, entered Ivan's cell and murdered him in cold blood, stabbing him repeatedly with their swords or bayonets while he slept or tried to defend himself. Ivan VI, the boy emperor, the forgotten prisoner of Schlüsselburg, died thus, at the age of 23, the victim of a botched conspiracy and secret orders that had sealed his fate long ago. The exact moment of his death, amid the chaos and violence of that night, was recorded in the annals of infamy. The atmosphere immediately after his death was one of confusion and horror. Mirovich, upon discovering that his attempt to free Ivan had ended with the murder of the man he intended to restore to the throne, surrendered unconditionally. He was arrested, summarily tried, and executed shortly thereafter in St. Petersburg. The officers who had murdered Ivan VI, although formally investigated, were discreetly acquitted and rewarded for having fulfilled their duty. Empress Catherine the Great, although publicly lamenting Ivan's unfortunate death, could not hide her relief at the permanent disappearance of a dynastic threat that had weighed on her throne since the beginning of her reign. The climax of Ivan VI's tragedy was not a death on the battlefield or a public execution after a trial, but a stealthy and brutal murder in the darkness of a cell, an end as anonymous and obscure as most of his life had been. The revelation, or rather the confirmation of his death, put an end to the existence of a man who had been king without knowing it and prisoner without deserving it, one of the most innocent and forgotten victims of the relentless struggle for power in Imperial Russia. The official announcement of the death of Ivan VI, the deposed boy emperor, although presented as the regrettable but inevitable result of an attempt at sedition and rescue by an unbalanced officer, failed to completely silence the rumors and suspicions surrounding his tragic end. For many, both in Russia and abroad, Ivan's murder in the Schlüsselburg fortress was the logical and predictable culmination of a cruel and relentless state policy aimed at eliminating any possible threat to the throne of Empress Catherine the Great. The reaction of the Russian court was, in general, one of barely concealed relief. Ivan VI's disappearance eliminated at a stroke a dynastic pretender who, although forgotten and isolated, had always represented a certain discomfort and a possible focus for conspiracies. Catherine the Great, although she publicly expressed her regret at the unfortunate incident, took no serious measures to punish those directly responsible for the murder, officers Vlasiev and Chekin, who were discreetly rewarded, and hastened to close the case, presenting Vasily Mironovich as the sole culprit of the tragedy, an ambitious and crazy adventurer who had paid for his audacity with his life. Among the Russian people, the news of Ivan VI's death, whose existence was barely known to most, probably did not cause much of a stir, beyond the morbid curiosity or compassion that the story of an imprisoned and murdered child emperor might arouse. His figure, erased from official memory for decades, had not had time to sink into the popular imagination like that of other Romanov Tsars. The fate of Ivan VI's body was as obscure and anonymous as his life had been. After his murder, his body was buried in secret, without any ceremony or honors, in an unknown location within the walls of the Schlüsselburg fortress, or perhaps in its vicinity. There was no official grave, no tombstone, no monument to commemorate his existence. Every effort was made to erase any material trace of this short-lived and ill-fated emperor. It was not until many years later, during the reign of Paul the Rund, son of Catherine the Great, who paradoxically would also be assassinated in a coup d'état, that attempts were made to locate his remains and give them a more dignified burial, but without conclusive results. The exact location of Ivan VI's tomb remains a mystery to this day. The immediate political consequences of Ivan VI's death were, in reality, few, as he did not represent a real and imminent threat to Catherine the Great's consolidated power. However, his murder did have an impact on the Empress's image, especially abroad, where some enlightened intellectuals who admired Catherine began to question the true nature of her enlightened despotism. The case of Ivan VI revealed the darkest and most ruthless side of Russian absolutism and the ease with which the raison d'etat could justify the most heinous crimes. The new questions that arose after his death, or rather those that were confirmed, revolved around the degree of Catherine's direct involvement in the order to kill him. Was it a decision she made herself, or simply an inevitable consequence of previous orders to execute him in the event of a rescue attempt? Could she have prevented his death if she had wanted to? These questions, although unanswered, continued to fuel debate and the dark legend of the Empress. The imminent chaos that could have resulted from a successful rebellion led by Mirovich in the name of Ivan VI was thus avoided, but at a very high price, the life of an innocent man and an indelible stain on the conscience of a regime. The violent and premature death of Ivan VI of Russia in the grim fortress of Schlisselburg, at the age of 23 and after more than 2 decades of cruel and inhumane imprisonment, was not simply the end of a tragic and forgotten life. It was also the closing of a dark and often silenced chapter in the history of the Romanov dynasty, and a grim reminder of the brutality and arbitrariness of absolute power in 18th century imperial Russia. The legacy of Ivan VI is, paradoxically, that of an emperor who never consciously reigned, that of a prisoner whose only crime was to have been born with royal blood at a time of dynastic instability, and that of a ghost whose mere existence represented a constant threat to those who occupied the throne after him. His story, although long hidden or minimized by official Russian historiography, has gradually emerged as a moving and terrible example of the cruelty of raison d'etat and the fragility of innocence in the face of the excessive ambitions of power. On the political level, the physical elimination of Ivan VI definitively consolidated the power of Catherine the Great, removing the last Romanov pretender who could, at least in theory, dispute the legitimacy of her throne, which she herself had acceded to through a coup d'etat and the assassination of her husband Peter III. With Ivan's death, Catherine ensured that there were no viable dynastic alternatives that could be used by discontented factions or foreign powers to destabilize her regime. However, this act of realpolitik also had a moral cost for the Empress, as it tarnished her image as an enlightened despot and exposed her to criticism from those who saw the murder of a defenseless prisoner as proof of her tyranny. Despite attempts to erase his memory, Ivan VI eventually became a symbol of the innocent victims of Russian absolutism. His story was rescued by some writers and playwrights of the 19th and 20th centuries, who saw him as a tragic figure, a kind of Russian man in the Iron Mask, whose life was sacrificed on the altar of dynastic politics. His fate has been compared to that of other child kings or royal prisoners, whose existence represented a threat to the rulers of their time, such as the princes in the Tower in England, or the Dauphin Louis XVII during the French Revolution. The moral or existential lesson to be drawn from the unhappy life and death of Ivan VI is perhaps that of the terrible injustice that often accompanies power struggles, and how the weakest and most innocent individuals can become scapegoats for the ambitions of others. His story reminds us that birthright, which in theory should guarantee security and privilege, can become a terrible curse when mixed with political instability and the unscrupulousness of those in power. It also invites us to reflect on the nature of historical oblivion and the importance of rescuing the voices and stories of those who have been silenced or marginalized by power. The question that continues to echo through the centuries is whether Ivan VI's fate could have been different, whether there was any alternative to his long imprisonment and violent death. Was his elimination an inevitable necessity for Russia's stability, as his executioners may have argued? Or was it simply an unnecessary and abominable crime, the result of fear and paranoia on the part of those who feared losing power? I invite you to share your own thoughts in the comments. How does the tragic story of Ivan VI make you feel? Do you think his sacrifice had any historical or moral justification? And if these chronicles of the darkest and often forgotten ends of royalty move you, and invite you to reflect, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like us, and join us on our next journey into the depths of history, where there are always new truths to discover and new injustices to remember. Injustices to remember. Injustices to remember. Injustices to remember. Injustice.